April 1945. Germany was a smoking husk, a land silenced by ruin, and the world that had once vibrated with the flourish of brass bands now only registered the dull rhythm of boots slogging through mud. In Bavaria, remnants of snow still clung stubbornly to the edges of the pine forests, melting into sluggish, gray rivers that carried the last lingering ashes of the Reich. American forces had breached the Rhine and were now flooding through every road and valley, their olive-drab trucks groaning under the weight of rations, their flags stark and vibrant against the pervasive desolation. Yet, the men inside those vehicles, mere boys truly, didn't feel the pride of conquerors. They were simply exhausted, profoundly weary, and aching for peace. Private Jack Miller, a 21-year-old from Wichita, Kansas, rode in the back of a swaying jeep, the spring sun glinting off his helmet. His hands, roughened by weeks on the move, rested on a rifle he no longer possessed any desire to fire. He had witnessed too much in too brief a time. The charred skeletons of tanks, white flags fluttering from the windows of barns, and endless columns of prisoners stretching beyond the visible horizon. "It's over," someone muttered beside him. But Jack knew better. The war might be concluding on paper, yet the very land itself was still struggling to draw breath. They drove through a village known as Hak, or what remained of it. Roofs were gone, church bells hung silent and broken, windows were crudely stuffed with rags. A small child stood by the roadside, clutching a faceless doll. An old man, his head bowed as the convoy passed, seemed neither hostile nor grateful, just utterly hollow. Jack impulsively tossed him a cigarette from the jeep. The man caught it with a practiced reflex of survival, then stared at the cigarette as if unsure whether to smoke it or offer it as a prayer. The convoy halted near a cluster of stone farmhouses. Their orders were straightforward: secure the area, account for any civilians, and prepare for a new prisoner processing post. Word had circulated that a few German officers had fled south with the last of their remaining men, abandoning their families, household staff, and anyone else who couldn't escape the crumbling regime. Jack jumped from the jeep, his boots sinking into the thawed mud, and the air enveloped him, sweet with the promise of spring, yet acrid with the lingering scent of gunpowder. "Keep your eyes sharp, men," Sergeant Bell called out. "This place looks deserted, but I don't trust ghosts." Jack nodded, his gaze sweeping across the desolate fields. Cows lay stiff and still beside barbed wire fences. A faint plume of smoke rose from a collapsed bakery, and in the distance, a church spire leaned precariously, like a compass needle forever broken. Every few minutes, he caught the distant crack of a rifle, the sound of some stubborn, desperate last stand dissolving into the hills. But beneath the insistent wind, there was another sound, faint and distinctly human, like weeping carried across the cold stone. He followed the sound past an orchard, stripped bare of blossoms, to a barn that seemed more like a tomb than a refuge. A tattered white sheet hung on the heavy door, crudely painted with a red cross, made from what looked like children's paint. Jack hesitated, his fingers tightening instinctively on his rifle. The Geneva symbol typically signified surrender, or at least a desperate plea for mercy, but in these final, chaotic days, desperation rendered all things uncertain. Inside, the air was frigid and heavy with the smell of straw and sickness. It took his eyes a moment to adjust to the dim light. Then he saw them. 5, perhaps 6 women, wrapped in torn shawls, their faces pale as candle smoke. Around them, children huddled, quiet as stones. One older woman held a Bible pressed tightly to her chest. Another whispered softly to a boy who stared at Jack's boots with a dull, uncomprehending curiosity. There was no menace here, only the stark reality of hunger. Jack slowly lowered his rifle. "Are you folks alone here?" he asked, knowing full well they wouldn't understand his words. A younger woman, perhaps 25, stepped forward. Her hair was pulled back with a ribbon that had long since lost its color, and her dress was torn at the hem. She spoke in German, quick and soft, then caught herself and tried again, broken English trembling on her lips. Please, food. For children. We know eat 3 days. Behind Jack, Corporal Dugan entered, chewing gum, the faint scent of canned beans wafting from his pack. You got company, Miller? Jack nodded toward the group. Civilians. Starving. Dugan frowned. Regulations say we don't feed locals. Command says it encourages dependence. Dependence? Jack muttered, his gaze fixed on the children. Their fingers were blue with cold. Their lips cracked. The girl nearest him couldn't have been more than 6. She clutched an empty bread sack as if it were a cherished doll. Dugan sighed, then tossed a tin of beans onto the straw. Fine, but if the lieutenant asks, I didn't see it. The can rolled to a stop near the woman's feet. She froze, as though unsure if it were real, then dropped to her knees and picked it up with the reverence one might show a sacred relic. Tears welled in her eyes, but a fragile smile bloomed on her face. A tiny, broken smile that caught Jack off guard. Danke, she whispered, clutching the can to her chest. Danke. Jack reached into his own pack, pulling out a wrapped square of cornbread and a chocolate bar. The woman hesitated, her eyes flickering from the insignia on his sleeve, the white star of a conqueror, to the food in his hand. Slowly she reached out. Her fingers brushed his, cold and trembling. For a fleeting moment, the entire war seemed to hold its breath. He wanted to utter something decent, something truly human, but the words came out clumsy, almost like a jest. You're my bride now, he said softly, his voice a mix of nervous laughter and deep unease. The soldiers behind him chuckled, but the woman didn't grasp the humor. She bowed her head and began to weep, whispering something in German that sounded like a prayer. Jack felt a flush creep up his neck. Hey, I didn't mean. He stopped, realizing it didn't matter. The words had already left his mouth, and somehow they no longer felt like a joke at all. Outside, a cold wind swept across the fields. The very nature of the war had shifted. Victory no longer felt like triumph, but a crushing weight of responsibility. The men began to pack up, muttering about orders and curfews. Jack lingered by the doorway, watching as the woman carefully broke the cornbread into tiny pieces, passing them to the children first. None of them spoke, but a gratitude heavier than gunpowder hung palpable in the air. As he finally turned to leave, he glanced once more at the barn. Through a narrow crack in the door, he saw her watching him, the woman with the faded ribbon, her eyes shining in the dim light. No longer pleading, she was simply seeing him, as if trying to etch his face into her memory. That night, camped near the village, Jack found sleep elusive. The whisper of the woman's voice, the fleeting touch of her fingers, it all stayed with him. Around him, the other soldiers laughed, played cards, and talked of going home. But his thoughts remained tethered to that barn. He scrawled a line in his small field notebook. Asterisk, some of them still believe in God. Maybe that's what's keeping them alive. Asterisk, then he paused, his pen hovering over the page. Another line followed, quieter, more reflective. Asterisk, I think I might, too. Asterisk, in the distance, thunder rolled, or perhaps it was artillery. He couldn't differentiate anymore. But somewhere within that storm, he felt the fragile weight of something he hadn't known since before the war, mercy. As dawn rose over the broken valley, he stood watch by the road, his rifle slung loosely, his eyes fixed on the horizon. Behind him, the barn's roof glinted faintly in the nascent light, like a signal waiting to be answered. And though he didn't yet know it, the next time he would see that Red Cross flag, it would not be as a soldier guarding the defeated, but as a man standing at the very edge of forgiveness. By morning, the persistent rain had transformed the Bavarian roads into churning rivers of gray mud. The soldiers moved out in silence, their boots making sucking sounds against the saturated ground, trucks roaring past in bursts of exhaust and engine growl. Jack Miller sat in the back of a transport, his mind miles behind, in that barn with the woman whose name he didn't know. He could still vividly see her face as she meticulously broke the cornbread for the children, her hands trembling with both hunger and profound care. There was something about that gesture, so simple, so quietly powerful, that haunted him. It wasn't mere pity he felt. It was a profound recognition, a flash of shared humanity in a landscape that seemed to have forgotten the very meaning of the word. The convoy paused near a crossroads to refuel. The sergeant barked orders. Men cursed, smoked, and checked their rifles. Jack, however, kept glancing toward the valley, half expecting to see the Red Cross sheet waving in the wind. He told himself it was foolish. He was just one soldier in an army of millions. But the persistent thought of leaving those people without more food gnawed at him more fiercely than any hunger of his own. "Still thinking about that kraut?" Dugan asked, slapping Jack's shoulder. "You got a soft spot, Miller. Dangerous thing in times like these." Jack didn't reply. He simply stared down at his canteen, watching the surface ripple with rain. That afternoon, the unit returned to the village with supply wagons. Officially, the provisions were destined for the prisoner of war camp forming on the edge of town. But Jack knew intimately how desperately the civilians needed them. The German army had confiscated their last livestock. The rail lines were bombed, the stores looted. Even the fields, black and tilled and ready for spring, lay untouched. Hunger was everywhere, a quiet and invisible predator, gnawing at the land from within. When the lieutenant granted permission for a rest, Jack slipped away. He followed the familiar muddy trail, past the orchard and the broken fence, until the barn reappeared, as stubborn and vivid as a memory refusing to die. The white sheet was gone now. Perhaps they had burned it for warmth. He hesitated at the door, his heart pounding as though he were entering a sacred place. Inside, the air was damp and still. A few children were curled under blankets made from old uniforms. The woman sat by a small, sputtering fire built from splintered planks, turning the empty bean tin in her hands as if it were pure gold. When she saw him, she stood quickly, startled, her eyes wide but devoid of fear. He lifted the canvas sack from his shoulder and gently placed it on the ground. "Food?" he said, keeping his voice low. "For you." "For them?" She blinked, unsure, then stepped closer. "Why?" "Because you asked," he said simply. He knelt and opened the sack. 2 more tins of beans, a small loaf of bread, and another chocolate bar. Her breath caught in her throat. For a moment, she simply stared, then pressed a hand to her mouth, whispering something that sounded like, "Gott segne dich, God bless you." He smiled faintly. "Guess I'll take that as thanks." The children stirred, drawn by the enticing smell. She motioned them over, dividing everything with mathematical precision, ensuring each child received a share, taking hers last. She didn't eat until they had finished, and even then, she tore the loaf's crust so small it barely filled her palm. Jack watched in silence, his throat tight with emotion. "You're not from here," she said finally, her accent careful but soft. "Can't you tell?" he replied. "America," she nodded, her eyes bright with a strange curiosity. "You fight Germans?" "Yeah," he said. "But not you." A flicker of something akin to relief passed over her face. "My husband, he died near Nuremberg," she murmured. No letter, only silence. "I'm sorry," Jack said. She looked up at him, puzzled by his tone. "You say sorry, but you win." Jack didn't know what to say. Outside, the wind howled through the gaps in the boards, carrying the echo of distant artillery. Faint now, but still there, like thunder from another, forgotten world. He looked at her again, at the way her shoulders curved inward, not from fear, but from profound exhaustion. The war had stolen the shape of her life, but not her dignity. "Do you have a name?" he asked. She hesitated, as though the word might cost her something precious. "Anna," He repeated it softly, letting it settle in the air. Anna, she nodded. And you, Jack? There was a pause, an awkward, tender stillness that filled the barn like a shared breath. She smiled faintly for the first time, her face softening. Jack? She repeated, the sound uncertain but gentle on her tongue. He wanted to say something else, something deeply meaningful, but instead, he simply took the chocolate bar and held it out. For you. She shook her head. No, children. They already had theirs, he said, lying only a little. Slowly, she took it. Her hands trembled. She broke off one small piece, placed it on her tongue, and closed her eyes. A single tear slipped down her cheek. I forget this taste, she whispered. Before war. Jack looked away. No one should have to forget something like that. For a moment, they said nothing. The only sound was the soft crackle of the small fire. Jack felt an absurd urge to stay, to guard them, to mend what couldn't be fixed. But he knew orders would come soon, and if the lieutenant discovered he was feeding civilians, there would be severe repercussions. He rose slowly. I'll come back tomorrow, he said. She looked alarmed. No, you know, Can. They find you. He smiled a little. Let them try. Before she could reply, footsteps echoed outside. Jack froze. Through a gap in the planks, he saw two soldiers from his unit walking past, rifles slung, laughing. He waited until their voices faded, then turned back to Anna. I have to go. She stepped closer, close enough that he could smell the faint trace of smoke and soap on her clothes. You are a good man, she said, her voice almost breaking. But good men die in war. Not all of them, he said, though it didn't sound entirely convincing. Her eyes searched his. You say I am your bride. Jack felt blood rush to his face. He hadn't realized she'd understood those words. It was a joke, he said quickly. I just meant, you don't have to beg anymore. But she didn't seem offended. Instead, she nodded slowly, as if translating the sentence into something sacred. Then I remember. He swallowed, unable to answer. Somewhere in that dim barn, the word bride had ceased to mean marriage. It had transformed into a promise, a fragile bridge spanning everything war had broken. When he finally stepped into the gray daylight, the sky was clearing. The rain had stopped, and sunlight glinted off the wet grass, sharp and silver. He stood there for a moment, listening to the distant hum of trucks, the world resuming its relentless machinery of occupation. Behind him, a faint voice called in German. One word only, his name spoken softly like a prayer. Jack. He turned, but she was just a shadow framed by the barn door. The children huddled around her, their small faces lit by the firelight. He raised his hand, uncertain whether it was a salute or a farewell. The wind carried the scent of spring and something else. Hope, fragile as a match flame. And as he walked back toward camp, he knew the rules would not deter him. Something stronger had begun to take hold, a hunger that no ration or military order could ever fill. He didn't see the two soldiers watching from the hill, their cigarettes glowing faintly in the dusk. The days blurred together in the soft collapse of war. Each sunrise brought a quieter kind of destruction. Villages stripped of men, fields slowly crawling back toward life, and a silence thick enough to feel sacred. The guns had ceased their roar in most directions, but the aftermath possessed its own distinct sounds. Boots sloshing through puddles, church doors creaking open for the first time in years, and the faint clang of tin cups in refugee camps. For Private Jack Miller, the end of combat had not brought peace. It had brought an awakening of conscience. He found endless excuses to remain near HAK. Guard duty, fuel runs, supply tallies. The lieutenant, preoccupied with processing surrenders, was too busy to notice one soldier disappearing for a few hours at a time. Each visit to the barn felt like trespassing into another world, one that no longer belonged to the army or the war. Anna met him differently each time. The first day she was wary. The The second, she offered him coffee boiled from scorched grain. By the third, she was laughing quietly when he attempted to pronounce her name with the correct German softness. The sound startled him. It had been months since he'd heard laughter that wasn't laced with madness or relief. The children had begun to treat him like a figure from a storybook. They would rush to the door when they saw his shadow, tugging at his sleeves, begging for tales of America. Jack recounted stories of vast wheat fields and rivers wider than roads, of Christmas lights strung across towns, and soda bottles that hissed when opened. They didn't understand every word, but they understood hope. Anna watched, her arms folded loosely, her eyes steady. "You speak like a priest," she said one evening. He chuckled. "Guess I just like telling stories." "Stories?" she repeated. "That is what people do after war. Tell stories to remember or to forget." He looked at her then, at the smudges of soot on her cheeks, the way her hair caught the glow of the lantern. "Which one are you doing?" "Both," she said and turned away. Outside, the hills glowed with the warm, orange light of late spring. American trucks thundered in the distance, carrying prisoners toward camps that reeked of diesel and disinfectant. Jack knew fraternization was strictly forbidden. General Eisenhower's directive was unambiguous. No personal contact with the enemy, especially German women. But as the days passed, the rule began to feel like a relic of another war, one fought by men who had never witnessed what starvation could do to the human spirit. Once he caught her humming as she patched a child's torn sleeve. The melody was faint, almost embarrassed. "That's pretty," he said. "What is it?" "An old song," she replied. "From when I was a girl. My mother used to sing it when the harvest was good." He smiled. "Maybe you'll sing it again when all this is over." She looked up, a flicker of something unreadable in her gaze. "Over?" she echoed. "Nothing is over, Jack. Only different now." He didn't argue. How could he? His own letters home had ceased months ago. His mother's house in Kansas was still standing, but after what he'd seen, he couldn't bring himself to describe the world as it truly was. One evening, he arrived with a small treasure, a comb he'd traded from a medic, made of pale horn, smooth as ivory. He handed it to Anna awkwardly, unsure how to explain its significance. She took it, her fingers brushing his once more. "This is too much." "It's just a comb," he said. "No," she replied softly. "It is kindness. That is always too much." The words struck him harder than bullets ever had. Later, as twilight fell, they sat outside the barn. The children were asleep inside, their breathing soft beneath the flicker of the dying fire. The world smelled of wet soil and wood smoke. Jack leaned against the fence post, his eyes tracing the fading sky. "You know," he said, "my sergeant would court-martial me if he knew I was here." Anna tilted her head. "Then why come?" He thought for a long time. "Because I think I owe you." She frowned. "Owe me?" "Not you. Your country. The people in it. For all the hate we threw your way and all the hate that threw back." She shook her head. "Hate is not a country. It is hunger. Same everywhere." The devastating simplicity of her words silenced him. She was right. Hate had always fed on emptiness. Empty stomachs, empty prayers, empty beds. The wind shifted, carrying the faint scent of lilac from the ruins beyond. For the first time, he noticed how her presence filled the space around him, not with fear, but with a strange calm. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was something close, an ache shaped like hope. He wanted to tell her that, but words felt clumsy. So he did something reckless. He reached for her hand. She stiffened, surprised, but didn't pull away. Her fingers were cold, her bones delicate as bird wings. They stayed like that, quiet, until a sound shattered the moment, the distant rumble of a jeep. Jack dropped her hand and stood. The engine drew closer, its lights cutting across the hill. "Stay inside," he said quickly. If anyone asks, I was never here. She nodded, though her eyes told him she understood far more than she let on. You risk much for me. He smiled faintly. Maybe I like risks. The jeep stopped on the road, its headlights sweeping across the barn. Jack stepped into the shadows, pretending to check his rifle. 2 military policemen climbed out, their voices sharp in the night. You, Miller, one called out. Lieutenant wants you now. Jack forced a casual salute. On my way. As he turned to leave, Anna appeared at the barn door, half hidden by the encroaching darkness. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second, enough time to convey every unspoken word. Back at camp, the lieutenant's tone was clipped. You've been off your post 3 times this week, Miller. Care to explain? Scouting supply routes? The lieutenant narrowed his eyes. Watch yourself, Miller. There's fraternization talk going around. You feed civilians, you answer to me. Understood? Jack nodded, feeling the burn of guilt rise in his chest. When he returned to his cot, he found a folded note tucked beneath his helmet. No name, no signature, just a line written in careful English letters. Asterisk, thank you for remembering I am human. Asterisk, he read it twice, then slipped it into his pocket. Sleep never came. By dawn, the MPs were gone, but their jeep tracks scarred the mud near the barn. Jack went anyway. The place was empty. The fire was cold, the blankets gone. For a moment, he thought she'd fled. He then spotted something on the ground. Her horn comb, still tied with the faded ribbon from her hair. He knelt and picked it up, his fingers trembling. The world outside buzzed with a newfound victory, but within him, everything felt profoundly hollow. As he turned to leave, a faint voice drifted from behind the barn. He spun around, his heart pounding in his chest. And there she was, standing by the old fence, sunlight catching in her hair, the children gathered beside her. She offered a weary but undeniable smile, utterly alive. You come back, she said softly, her voice a bomb. He exhaled, a laugh breaking through the sudden, overwhelming relief. Guess I'm not much good at following orders. Her smile deepened, but before he could speak again, a sharp, metallic sound sliced through the morning air. The distant growl of another jeep, growing steadily louder. This one carried a stark white star and the distinct, authoritative clang of military presence. Jack's hand instinctively went to his helmet. Anna, he whispered, go inside, please. She didn't move. Her eyes searched his face, steady and unafraid. And in that breathless moment, suspended between the warmth of the sunlight and the cold shock of discovery, mercy itself seemed to hold its breath. The jeep screeched to a halt in a churn of mud, its white star emblazoned brightly against the gray dawn. 2 military policemen stepped out, their heavy boots crunching on the frosted ground. The air was sharp enough to cut one's breath. Jack Miller stood frozen by the fence, the ribbon and comb still clutched tightly in his hand. Anna remained motionless. Behind her, the pale, spectral faces of the children peeked out from the barn door, like fragile ghosts. Private Miller, the sergeant barked, his voice cracking like a whip. You've been reported. Unauthorized contact with civilians. Feeding, fraternization. Hell, maybe worse. Jack straightened, the cumulative weight of weeks settling heavily on his shoulders. They're starving, he said quietly, his gaze unwavering. That's not your problem. The sergeant shot back, his tone sharp. Orders are clear. Locals get food through command, not charity. You want to help? File a report, don't hand out care packages. Jack's jaw tightened. A report won't keep them alive. The older MP sighed, pulling a cigarette from his coat pocket. You've got a big heart, son. Wrong war for it. They escorted him toward the jeep. Anna stepped forward, her eyes fierce despite the trembling in her hands. Please, she pleaded in broken English. He good man. He's a good man, ma'am, the sergeant replied, his voice devoid of sympathy. Good men get other men killed when they forget the rules. Jack turned once before the jeep door slammed shut. "Stay inside, Anna," he said, his voice urgent. "Don't let them take that barn from you." She shook her head, tears glinting in the pale light, but he forced a smile. "You're safe now. That's what matters." The drive back to camp was silent, each bump in the road feeling like a heartbeat, counting down something inevitable. At headquarters, the lieutenant was waiting, his cap tilted at a severe angle, his expression cold and unyielding. "You've made quite a name for yourself, Miller," he stated, his words clipped. "Handing out rations to the very people we're supposed to be processing. You know the fraternization directive." "Yes, sir." "Then you also know it's punishable." Jack didn't flinch. "With respect, sir, so is letting children starve." The lieutenant studied him for a long, quiet moment. "You think compassion makes you righteous?" "I think it makes me human." For a moment, neither spoke. Outside, engines hummed, the war's relentless machinery grinding forward as if none of their personal drama mattered. Finally, the officer sighed. "You'll be transferred. Logistics division near Regensburg. That's lenient, considering." Jack saluted. "Understood." The lieutenant leaned back. "One more thing, Miller. You didn't marry her, did you?" Jack's lips parted, caught between shock and a bitter laugh. "No, sir." "Good," the man said, his voice flat. "The army doesn't need love stories." He left that night. The sky hung low and iron-colored, the roads choked with endless convoys and displaced souls. Refugees pushing carts, old men dragging what little furniture they had, columns of soldiers marching in silence. The closer they got to Regensburg, the more the land looked stripped clean, as though mercy itself had been evacuated from the scarred earth. Jack stared out the truck window, the image of the barn flickering behind his eyes like a film reel, a scene he couldn't stop replaying. At the new base, the days turned mechanical, a monotonous routine. He loaded crates, counted ration tins, signed manifests. He didn't talk much. The men around him spoke of going home by Christmas, of girls waiting stateside, of medals and parades. Jack said nothing. He'd begun to write letters he never sent, letters to Anna. They were short, plain like prayers. Asterisk, "Are you warm? Did the children eat? Do you still hum that song when it rains?" Weeks passed before he saw the Red Cross symbol again, painted fresh on a train car marked "Displaced Persons." He was unloading medical supplies when he heard her name. One of the aid workers read it from a manifest. Anna Bauer, transferred from HAK to Regensburg Refugee Zone, Section C. His heart lurched. That night, under the deep cover of darkness, he found the camp. It wasn't a prison. Not exactly. Just fences and floodlights, rows of tents sagging under the constant rain. He moved quietly between them, searching face after face until he found her. She was kneeling by a cot, gently washing a child's feet in a basin. Her hair was shorter now, her cheeks thinner, but her eyes, those same eyes that had looked through him like a confession, hadn't changed. When she saw him, she froze, then rose slowly. For a long time, neither spoke, the rain drumming against the tent roof like the ceaseless patter of unspent gunfire. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I had to know you were alive." "I am," she said softly. "Because of you," he began, then shook his head. "No, because you survived." She smiled faintly, a smile that carried both profound gratitude and a lingering grief. "You come back, and now you go again." He reached into his coat and handed her a folded scrap of paper. "It's a requisition form. It'll get you and the children extra rations, maybe even blankets." She hesitated, her eyes searching his. "You risk again?" Jack shrugged, a faint smile touching his lips. "Some rules deserve breaking." She stepped closer, her gaze unwavering. "War makes monsters and saints. You are neither. You are a tired man who remembers kindness." He laughed quietly. That about sums it up. The child at her side tugged her sleeve, whispering. Anna knelt, listening, then looked back at Jack. She says, "You bring back God." He blinked hard, a lump forming in his throat. Tell her he never left. They stood in silence, the air between them thick with everything unsaid. He wanted to tell her he dreamt of that barn, of her laughter, of a fleeting moment of peace. He wanted to tell her he'd never been more afraid of forgetting. But before he could, footsteps crunched outside a patrol. Anna gripped his arm, her urgency palpable. "Go." He hesitated. "Anna, go," she said again, more urgently now. "You give me life now. Keep yours." He nodded once, a silent promise, then slipped out into the rain-soaked night. Behind him, the tent glowed faintly, her shadow moving within, one small flame against the endless gray. By July, the war was officially over. Europe began to breathe again, though in shallow, staggered gasps. The U.S. occupation loosened its bands, and by 1946, soldiers were marrying German women in secret chapels, love blossoming as rebellion's quiet twin. Jack never saw Anna again, but he heard her name once more. It was scribbled in a Red Cross list sent to his unit, relocated to Munich. Anna Bauer, refugee sponsor pending. Next to her name, a single note in faded ink. Safe. He kept that paper folded in his pocket until the day he finally left Germany. On the ship home, he stood on the deck as the continent shrank into mist. Around him, men cheered, sang, planned their futures. Jack just watched the horizon, wondering if mercy truly had a shape, if it looked like a barn in Bavaria or a woman smiling through hunger. Years later, when peace had become history, and history had softened into memory, Jack would tell his son one story from the war. Not about battles or medals or glory, just a woman who asked for food and a soldier foolish enough to say, "You're my bride now." He'd laugh at his own words, though his eyes would soften with a distant tenderness when he did. And if anyone asked what he meant, he'd answer quietly, "I meant she'd never have to beg again, because that was the lesson the war had left him. Not that mercy was weakness, but that it was the last, most defiant form of courage." As the camera of time fades, the image that remains is simple. A barn standing under Bavarian rain, a Red Cross flag fluttering faintly, and the ghost of a promise carried across oceans. And somewhere in that echo of surrender and survival, mercy still speaks, soft as a prayer, stronger than victory.